Hello everyone, welcome to Your World or Mine. Show me yours and I'll show you mine. Today we have Fyodor here from Oakland in San Francisco area, in the Bay Area. And we want to welcome you, Fyodor. And as you know, I'm from another planet. And this is my first visit to Earth. So
It's an honor to meet you.
Yeah, so today I'm going to ask you...
On behalf of the Earthlings, we greet you here on this planet that we still have so far.
That's a good start. The planet that you have so far. What do you mean by that?
There are 7 billion of us.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of having a huge impact on the planet, and we see we'll see how this will evolve, because we need to change our practices pretty fast in order to reverse some of the worrisome trends, like plastic pollution and CO2 emissions and a lot of other stuff. And in the meantime, we still cannot get along with each other. So we're still far from world peace and all these other essential things that allow us to flourish on this planet. And the planet is not doesn't have the capacity to accommodate the enormous amount of human beings. So we need to really be mindful, human beings, with these sort of practices that we have, right? So we need to change our practices in order to be able to sustain the life that has been evolving over millions of years. I don't know, how did you manage to do that on your planet, if you did?
We're trying to, let me say, we aspire to. We don't even like to use the word try, because then it doesn't mean you're really committed. But we aspire to, and our intention is to live more consciously. And there are very interesting things, like you mentioned, that human beings struggle, it seems, to live together in peace. And we have managed to discover some very interesting ways of living together and how we communicate with each other, which helps us on my planet. But you mentioned something that I'm really interested in. So when you speak about all these horrible things like plastic pollution and CO2 emissions, and you speak about practices in particular, for my people's, just for their information, when you speak about a practice, is that the way you live? What is a practice?
So in this particular case, I mean behavioral patterns. So how we live our life and what it entails. So, for example, some of the statistics that is popular here in the United States is that in one day, U.S. population consumes the number of plastic straws that is enough to circle the Earth 3 times around the equator.
Wow.
Just plastic straws, just one day, just one country, right? And this is a practice. So because you don't really need a straw to drink, it's not a necessity. You can drink from a glass, or you can use reusable straws from like glass straws, or even natural straws with biodegradable straws. So we don't really need to have plastic straws, but because when plastic straws appeared, there were relatively few of them, and they were cheap and pretty kind of nice to use. Nobody thought about the consequences when the production reaches these quantities. And now nobody thinks about that big picture. Like not nobody, but generally, the majority of people do not think about that. And also there are some vested interests, of course, of the manufacturers, et cetera, that are in place that lock us in that reality that nobody likes.
That's very interesting, because what you mentioned now brings up 2 things for me. And from our perspective, the way we're looking at it is that for humans to really exist in the future and to have joyful, abundant lives where everybody can live together in peace and harmony, humans need to start to think more consciously of everything they do. They need to become more aware. And we're very excited about that, because on our planet, awareness is the first thing. we believe that on Earth, and you can correct me if I'm wrong in my perception, because it's simply a perception, is that awareness becomes from before development. And we know, especially you talk about developing countries, you talk about leadership development, management development, talent development, also personal development. But for us, before development, awareness comes first. And for us, it's a completely different thing. Because I can tell you, but what you told me just now, which you shared so beautifully about the consequences of our actions, is you tell me about it, but in my context, it might not have any meaning, because in my awareness, it doesn't have any context. So it simply means nothing to me. I hear it, but it has no meaning. So for us, the awareness parts bring in the meaning part of to show us the rest of the picture.
Two comments on that. One is a little bit more technical, and another is a little bit more in depth. Development. You mentioned development and meaning, right? So even the word development has many meanings, and I know that, for example, some of my colleagues come from the international development background, and some of my colleagues come from psychology background. So sometimes I see the clashes between folks from international development and folks from psychology when everybody talks about systemic change and things like that. And international development folks say, development is such a bad word. Development is horrible. It's colonial. It's basically, it means that we don't understand how to change things. And, the psychology folks don't understand that, because human development, the development of the mind, is a completely different context than World Bank and United Nations initiatives like in developing countries, right? But what you mean by development, as far as I understand, is international development, right? So it's not the development of human consciousness, of human mind, it's development of economy, development of society, right? So, and in this context, one concept I like that is very useful in the work that we do is called ontological designing. And ontological designing is a theory of design developed around the year when I was born, like 1985, right? By Fernando Flores and Terry Winograd in the United States. And basically it's it's a very complex and complicated book that deals with cybernetics and philosophy and stuff like that. But the basic principles are very simple. Three basic principles. One is we as humans are designers by nature. So whatever we do is an act of design. It just can be unconscious design, but we design our social reality with everything we do, and we cannot give up doing that, right? We cannot resign from that position, right? We are designers, so we need to accept the responsibility, right? Second, and that is relevant to the connection between awareness and development. So second principle of ontological design is whatever we design, sooner or later comes back and designs us, our perception, our awareness, right? And then the third principle is most of the time we design unconsciously. We don't know what we design. But then the invitation here is to be more conscious or more aware of what we design and what designs us. So awareness, not only about the state of the world, but also awareness of our own mind and our own perception and how it's shaped by the cultural institutional context and how our actions and our thoughts, our worldviews impact what we contribute to that context, right? And so one of the, what are our institutions, right? Here we, so the ontological design is based on the work of John Searle, an American philosopher of language. And he talks about observer-dependent reality and observer-independent reality. So observer-independent reality is a physical reality out there, the molecules, the particles, all this kind of stuff. And so whatever you believe in, the table, the notebook, and whatever, the wall will stay there. However, we assign functions to that, right? So the fact that we sit on a chair and that we don't usually sit on a table depends on us, depends on how we classify these objects and how we interact with these objects, right? Humans started doing that, and we started sharing that as culture. And at some point, this function became disattached from the physical reality at all. So if you think, and that's how institutions got created, right? So for example, if we think about money, it used to be quite physical. So some objects that we used to exchange. And then now money is not a physical object. It does not have an attachment to physical object. And if we all stop believing in money, then money will stop existing, right? However, if just one of us stops believing in money, then we'll trigger a set of reactions in our society that will eventually lead to some function that is attached to physical reality. We wouldn't have food, we would be in jail or whatever, right? So because other humans would do it to us. Other humans would make decisions whether or not we are worthy of being given food or staying free, right? And this is the drama of human institutions and the power of human institutions, right? So these institutions are in our collective awareness, right? So, and we need to change that. However, if only one of us changes this awareness, it doesn't quite work until we are in this together and we undergo collective process. And it's quite hard. It's quite hard to do that, to coordinate these efforts because there are there are differences and there are interests, but at the same time, there are fundamental assumptions that we all share. And it's hard to go beyond these differences and really sit with these important things that we all share. But it's an ongoing work that's going on here on this planet.
Wow. That sounds incredible. There's two things to it that comes up for me, and from our perspective, where I am, is that it gives humanity and Earth, the world, a huge opportunity to begin to live differently. Because it feels as, when you speak about the drama part of it, it's something that I've been reminded about this morning by another human, which is the difference between drama and authoring. Where if you put your focus and your attention on authoring this new reality that you are speaking about, if one person starts and then collectively there's mass, gravity starts kicking in, becomes like a magnet. But it's also a choice for humans to become aware of, that there's actually a choice of which side they actually want to be stuck in the drama, where people have invested a lot of emotional, mental, spiritual, physical energy and other and resources, and on the other side where there's this new way. And do you people in Earth call it evolution, for example?
Yeah, there are many ways to talk about that, because I mean, yeah, of course, some of my colleagues, and especially my partner and mentor, Manuel Manga, calls it conscious evolution. Right, conscious evolution. So, but that's specific school of thought. So there are, I guess, thousands of people calling it that way, but there are 7 more billion people who might not call it that way.
But you see, that makes your life on Earth so fascinating, because of this diversity. But for us, it goes back to the energy that's behind it. The way you express it, so the names, the associations that humans gave things to be able to understand it, and like you said, to be part of a specific reality, is very interesting, because you get attached to it. And then it becomes your frame of reference. So everything new then does not fit into that frame.
Exactly.
And then there's inner conflict as well. Where do I fit in? Because I've invested so much in this specific frame of reference. But there's also not space for anything else, because it's so full of stuff. So what do you do?
Yeah, this reminds me of a story when my friend told me about, his work in India, in remote villages. They asked people in middle school, like kids, what would you be if you have all the resources in the world and no barriers? And most kids said policeman or teacher, because these were their role models. These were the best things they've seen, they had seen, right, in their community. And it is fascinating to somebody from a different background to kind of witness that story or to hear that story. But we're all living in our bubbles. And in the world of conscious evolution, I see people kind of really battling around flourishing versus thriving. It's like, what is good for humans, flourishing or thriving? Flourishing, no, thriving.
But you know, it's so funny actually. I mean, I laugh at it with a lot of respect. But it is really funny because you were mentioning the language professor earlier, the philosopher earlier about language, because for us, language is also the vocabulary is a very important part of it. But it's again something that you get attached to, like you say. Then you argue about nonsensical things, because for us that's nonsensical. Go to the real issue, whatever you call it. And that's the beauty for us about humanity, is that the diversity of the uniqueness of the expression of the same energy. And that's okay. But if you were speaking about these bubbles, and I start seeing it more and more when I have these type of encounters with humans, is that what happens when these bubbles now collide and they really, they merge into each other? What happens? Because for me, as an alien, that sounds like fun, actually.
Yeah, and definitely we need to step out of the bubbles. And also there is, at least in our meta bubble of different systemic change efforts, or whatever you call it, over the last, especially year maybe, or like year and a half, the conversations around meta networks intensify. This is another buzzword, like meta networks. Oh, there are many networks of like thousands of people doing some change work around a specific methodology or a specific kind of approach, and we need a meta network. And then so I was invited to some of these conversations and felt very uncomfortable, and I tried to sit with it and see like what is wrong with that. And usually like folks got frustrated every time the conversation was diving deeper. It's like, and then I had this this idea, this thought, probably it's like, hey, you're trying to create a meta network that acts exactly as a normal network or a community of practice. So what you do, you're actually trying to choose one language that rules them all, right? You turn to one identity. You need to forge shared commitments, right? And all this kind of stuff, right? And you become jealous when people choose either identity over your identity, or prioritize other identity, right? And this is not really how meta networks work. And what we need is not like a central name for the network and infrastructure and all this kind of stuff. What we probably need for meta networks is learning protocols that also are decentralized, and we're just exchanging this information and basically apply what is useful, right? So, for example, whenever we meet somebody from a different bubble, so we need to develop the capacity to really quickly learn what is it that unites us. So what is it that we all share, and not just words, because you see development can be in different contexts, right? Intellectually, like design can be very different things. For some people, unconscious design is an oxymoron, right? For some people, like Fernando Flores, unconscious design is a thing, right? So we need to understand, oh, you're based on ontological designing school, like your design is based on that, and your design is more graphic design, right? So we need to understand what we share, then what we can immediately learn from each other that fits our worldviews already is just like new way to look at the basic things we already know. And we can right, learn some practices or expand our understanding of certain things very fast from each other. And then there are things that we don't know about each other. We don't really understand what it is that you're talking about or how you do this stuff. So we need to sit with inquiries together and try to like learn more about it. And there are certain things that we believe we understand, but we do not necessarily agree with. And oh yeah, I see where you're coming from, and our approach is different, and I think I understand why it is different, and I prefer our approach not over your approach, and that's good. I prefer it for what we do. However, here it is very important to give legitimacy to other, not to think that your approach is necessarily better than the other approach, even if you unconsciously think that way, because we tend to think that our approaches are better. And they say, yeah, I mean, that's normal, but that's my personal opinion. That's my assessment. And this assessment could be grounded in certain evidence, in certain assertions that I have about my approach versus the other approach, but it still can be incorrect, right? And this legitimacy given to other approach in this change efforts, I think, is essential for us to really allow for experimentation and learning from each other. Because in some case, if that other approach works much better than mine, I shouldn't be attached to my approach and should be ready to embrace the other approach because it's just helpful. And we're all in this together in this sense. It's not about becoming a savior of the world. It's about making the world a better place. It doesn't matter who makes the world a better place. It's like, hey, let's do that job first over the next couple of 100 years, and then we can probably relax and give credit to each other, right?
You know what comes up while you were sharing this. Thank you very much for that. I think it's really helpful for especially the younger generations as well to start to begin to understand. And you must also again realize this is from our perspective, so it's not necessarily your truth or the truth. It's a truth and it's a perception. And for us, there's a big difference between all of those. If you just look at it from a language perspective, but also the meaning behind it. But from what you were sharing, what comes up for me is the investment people put into things, like you say, that they don't want to legitimize what somebody else has come up with. But it goes fast beyond that. Isn't it perhaps because of the way humans currently and in the last 100 years, and maybe it happened even before, has, from a personal perspective, to be seen in the world, the credibility was based on your knowledge, your education, your status, where you come from, all those type of things. But it's what you identified with. So you invested a lot of that in it, so that when you then come up with something, is it for the greater good, or is it to have credibility yourself? That for us, it's also very interesting how humans, they get into conflict about who said what. Isn't it more important about what is being said than who said it? And again, it goes back for me to what you were mentioning about legitimacy. I can't even pronounce that word. Because it is, for me personally as well, it's more important about what emerges that will make the world a better place, where everybody can thrive and flourish, whatever you want to call it, than whether it's me, the bright spark, who came up with the idea. Because I'm contributing to more, but it for me is where I'm on my development path. Is it where I'm still self-actualizing personally, and then from a design perspective and innovation perspective, the bigger picture. What is it? Where am I standing? So where's my station in life? Doesn't that sometimes also creates this conflict?
Yeah, but as far as I understand, like the original question that you have is about how did this happen to humans, right?
Yeah.
It's not necessarily like, because we discussed the state of things right here, but how did it happen? And this is a very good question, a very profound one, and I don't know the answer. Probably those with some more, with deeper knowledge of history would know, because I know that the cultures are incredibly diverse, and yet even even some of the cultures we kind of romanticize as more conscious and more aware. Once you dig deeper, they share some of the fundamental assumptions, right? With us, and it's like because there are a lot of things that we lost once through the colonialism and through enlightenment and all this kind of things, right? So we were a little bit better before, right? In terms of being aware of things, right? Of course, like the progress of science and everything, like it's an incredible thing. However, in terms of kind of connection with nature and connection with each other and being less isolated, right? Probably it was much better then. However, even when you take indigenous cultures, that is, again, we can learn a lot from them. However, you know, I remember one of my mentors was saying when they had a national level stakeholder engagement in a Latin American country, and they invited indigenous peoples to, like, a specific tribe to address the president and, you know, the stakeholders in the room, and they were kind of romanticizing them, meaning that they will share the indigenous wisdom with the room. And they basically were saying like, oh, finally you started listening to us. Okay, now we're better than all these other tribes out there. And remove all these other tribes so we can expand our brand. And it's like, wow. And everybody was like in shock. Because, you know, yeah, and it's tricky, and it's only one side of things, right? There are many different other things. Of course, there's a different relationship with the nature and with each other, and there are things like Ubuntu from Africa, for example, that is super alien to American individualism, for example, right? And is super healing for today's planet. And the society. So there are a lot of things we can learn from that. But to say that we've been on that path for just a few hundred years, I don't think it's necessarily correct. I think something happened, or maybe even evolved. Maybe we've been that way all the time. It's just we got the power to express ourselves and change things around us so fast that now it became a thing, right? But I don't know. Right, so the genesis of this thing is not really, but it's an important question. I just don't know exactly how it happened.
Yeah, but it's wonderful what came out when we were talking about it and seeing what emerges here. But you know, you're mentioning Ubuntu now, and I have had some interactions with people from Africa as well, who has their roots in Africa as well. And it's very interesting that although that concept's been used widely globally, if you talk to people like in South Africa, for example, where it's really birthed from as well, it's not relevant. There's the same individualism as you would find in the US. So it's just very interesting how and it's again a romanticization of something, which is a beautiful concept, but it's also not really practiced, embodied. It's not used, it's not practiced widely. Because from a collective perspective, I think from what we're experiencing, is everybody experiencing individualism on some level, or Ubuntu on some level. For some, it might be completely foreign, because for us, it's just a concept. It's again a concept or aspiration. But if you look at reality, it's not really happening in Africa at the moment either.
Yeah, but you see, Africa, I think these could well be because of the colonial past, because a big problem with the dominating Western culture is that it really destroyed a lot of alternatives, and really brutally destroyed, right? And whatever is not embodied now could have been embodied before, and also there are different things. on some fundamental level, like as a Russian, so I grew up in Russia, so I lived there until I was 26, so like socialized there. And Russia has many problems. So that's one of the main drivers for me to do this work, because I saw how sick Russian society is in many, many ways and traumatized. But there is interesting thing. I consider myself pretty much integrated into American society, having being comfortable interacting with Americans of different kinds. But I see this fundamental difference around moral categories, for example, even. That is, and it doesn't necessarily show up in everyday life, but whenever conversations become deeper, or like, right? So it's always there. And then finally, it is manifesting in the actual actions, right? So, you know, for example, in America, the key, as far as I understand, and many American friends confirm that integrity is the main moral category. It's like everybody is talking about integrity, and integrity is something that people try to manifest. It's important for them. And what integrity is that being at whole with what you think about yourself, what your values are, and how you express yourself, how people perceive you. Right? So people, it should be consistent. Your values, your actions, and perception of your values and action, right? Well, it's very alien for a Russian. It's like, what are you talking about? Because integrity is not even a word in Russian. There is no an adequate translation of integrity in the moral domain. It is something from topology, right? It's something from geometry. I don't know. It doesn't have anything to do with moral world, right? Moral domain. So basically, in Russia, the main concept is conscience. Conscience is the main thing. And it means that I don't really care what you think about what I do. I am the only judge of my actions. And this comes from, generally Judeo-Christian tradition that, have responsibility in front of God, even if anybody in the world, nobody in the world sees what I do, God can see what I do. So that means that that's the ultimate judge that transformed into kind of this disconnect from the society and really making judgment of your own actions. It is actually universal, I think, to many, not universal, it's true for many cultures that have Judeo-Christian roots. But in Russia, it kind of came to the extreme because we never trusted our institutions. We never trusted our justice system, for example. Right, so, and there is this moral dilemma that has been studied for decades by professors of ethics, and there is unanimous conclusion how this should be ethically resolved. Like, imagine a Jewish family fleeing from Nazi Germany, and they're faking their IDs, their passports to flee the Nazi Germany to save their lives. Is it ethical to forge documents in that case? Everybody so far agrees, yes, it's ethical to forge documents. It's not ethical to forge documents to get personal gain, for example, right? But it's ethical to do that in order to save your family, right? And because, of course, if they act with integrity and honestly tell the official that they're Jews fleeing Nazi Germany, they would be seized and killed, right? So in Russia, over the last hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, I think I would say maybe since the maybe 13th century, we never trusted our institutions, right? And because whenever you say that you want to do good, right, you're a threat and you're basically out of the picture. So the selection, the cultural selection, forced this sense of that, okay, I know what I do, but I don't necessarily need to tell you what I do because I don't trust you. So, but it's different in personal relationship. When there is a personal relationship, honesty is very important. and trust, but it's personal trust, and it's trust to a person, a human being, not an institution, right? And this is radically different from Americans. The Americans feel that they ultimately, even if the justice system is not good to them, at this point, they can mobilize others to go and protest and change the law and, you know, how things are implemented, right? And that's the way to go. So they feel that this is, so they need to act with integrity with the system in order to change the system. And Russians feel very different. It's like, hey, we don't trust the system, and we will never trust the system. So we just need to stick with how we, what we think about ourselves and what we should do, and this network of very close relationships whom we trust and things like that. And in China, for example, it's radically different. It's like 180 degrees from Russia in a way, which interestingly leads to the same behavior, kind of behavioral perceptions for Americans, for example. Some Americans say that Russians and Chinese are very similar in how they interact or behave, but it's radically different motivation, right? So you need to really base your moral actions on the society and how the society perceives you. And that's like, that's what determines. So cultures are different. And it is, even when you act kind of in a different environment, it still like fundamentally impacts how you do things. But I don't think that there was ever a culture that was in complete harmony with everything, without competition, without jealousy, without wars, things like that, right? If there were such cultures, and maybe I just don't know, because I'm not a historian, I'm not a cultural scientist. So maybe somebody in these conversations with you would share that example, and I would appreciate if you give me a link to that conversation. But I think that it's definitely, I think it's a huge loss that the Western culture started dominating so brutally over alternatives, because we could have selected different things from different cultures that really serve humans, right? But at the same time, I don't think that there was ever this ideal state of society that we have to go back to. We need to reinvent that and look into the future and see what we can create.
Oh, that really makes me excited, because I wanted to ask you as well. From what you share now is, thank you for that Russian perspective of what's happening in Russia and China in some way as well, is like you said, taking parts of what's working, what could benefit all of humanity, and still having your own individual identity. So, you know, you see in South Africa, for example, humans in South Africa don't have a single identity. That's very interesting because of its history. South Africans, for example, determine their place in the world based on race and tribe. But there's no patriotic type thing. You will never find it, because, and that's why it's called the Rainbow Nation. There's such a diversity, and they've been living together for such a long time, even with all that happened in South Africa with its history. Still, today, there's this diversity, and where you will have all these different parts. It's a really integrated society where people still live together, although they have these extreme different value systems, completely extreme different value systems. And like you explained with the integrity thing with Americans, for example, and then the Russians and their perspective. So maybe it's idealistic to think that something like that can work, but there's an example, maybe on a very simplistic level, maybe I'm simplifying it now, but it has been happening, that a society can actually live together and have these diverse, it's like a web coming together. So I think there is hope for humanity that something like that can happen in the future. And I'm also excited about what you mentioned about the future, of how you anticipate what we could do differently in the world in the future. And that's really where, from my planet's point of view, where we want to play a role in. It's to help humans to, there's other ways of looking into the future and tapping into the collective wisdom. And let the collective wisdom inform you rather than your own personal intelligence alone. And I think that might complicate things sometimes, when we really where we have our identity and when we talk from there, instead of being open to everything and to see what are the best parts, because it's maybe idealistic to think that these things can work together in harmony, but harmony is not sameness. I think that's also something that we picked up with from humans, is that sameness is not the same as oneness. You know, we hear these words, oneness.
Exactly, yeah.
And harmony is two different opposite forces. It's not the same force coming together. It's like in the orchestra, it's different instruments playing together and creating that most amazing sound. It's not the same one. And I think that sameness is causing a lot of problems coming before humans.
Yeah, no, I think that it's important that there is a misperception sometimes that people only can live in harmony, as you say, when there is sameness, right? So when we abandon our original identities and conform to a new identity, which is not true. This is completely not true. There are many other ways, and like accepting the legitimacy of other identities and creating these meta protocols, like we're talking about meta networks, like meta protocols of existing together with each other and accepting and celebrating the diversity, and this is not impossible. This is very much possible. And this fear that once we accept the legitimacy of other, we will lose our own identity is a fundamentally false assumption. It's based on a fundamental false assumption, right? So and yes, we should probably kind of change these fundamental assumptions that we share anyway. I think most human cultures share that false assumption of security being dependent upon the tribal identity, because as soon as you're not you're losing your attachment to your identity, you're losing your affiliation with the tribe, you're losing support of your tribe, you're excommunicated from your tribe. And that is like the deep fear. And once we get liberated from that assumption and losing identities, we do not abandon identities. We do not detach from our identities. We're just losing that attachment a little bit to be able to embrace other perspectives and give them legitimacy. And that would fundamentally, I think, shift our ability to coexist with each other and flourish together.
You know, on my planet, I totally agree with that. On my planet, we have a very simplistic way of looking at things like that. And we always ask the question, what wants to be known to me and through me today? Because it gives me legitimacy, or something wants to come through me. I need to share something with you that you might not be aware of. And you sharing something with me that I'm not be aware of. And at the same time, we learn from each other. We broaden our perspectives. We make place for more in our own lives and for the rest of the world. By simply asking that question to ourselves before every encounter, every morning when we wake up, simply asking that question opens up a lot, because it gives us that safety from a human personal level that, wow, I'm amazing. Something wants to be said through me to somebody today. And vice versa, I must be open that I don't know everything. We have on our planet, we have this thing about rightness. It's not about to be right, it's to be wise. Wise is you're open for more. You don't think that your way is the only way. But I know it.
Practice.
I know it might sound very simplistic and very idealistic, but it does work when you start operating.
Yeah, but it's a practice, and the simpler the practice is, the more effective it usually is.
Yeah. Jana, you speaking about practices, I quickly want to ask you about some of your initiatives. I had a little birdie on my shoulder telling me you're having all these interesting initiatives that you're busy with. Can you maybe share one or two with us quickly?
Oh yeah, sure, absolutely. Yeah, so I'll just share one, I guess, because that's probably the most relevant. So one of the things we've noticed when we try, so basically what the Institute does, the thing that I do with my mentor Manuel Menga, is that we help people develop leadership capacity to consciously redesign cultural institutional context and the worldviews for a better world. And as we were working with organizations, we noticed that we have to stay with them for a very long time if we want lasting change to happen. Otherwise, they get overwhelmed by the cultural and institutional context. And whenever somebody is trying to do like really deep systemic work, it's very hard to do because of how the funding works, because how even media coverage works, and how all these competitions work and stuff like that. So we try to create a support structure for people who are deep into addressing systemic root causes of social environmental issues and doing evolutionary work, where they can feel safe talking about that aspect of its work. They would not be considered crazy when we talk about how they impact the larger picture and how they collaborate with other stakeholders, because it's like usually they need to focus on something and present the financials and very and predicted outcomes and stuff like that, right? No. If you say that you don't know stuff, that's actually okay here, and it works in your favor if you are mindful about what exactly it is that that you don't know something consciously, so that you can, in whom you need to talk with, for example, whom you need to invite in the room to learn that. And also this fundamental understanding that you need to sit with a question for a long time and things might change and that your perception might not be true. Things like that, something that is usually unnecessary or can negatively affect your chances to get funding or stuff like that. So we try to invite people to openly talk about that because it's necessary to do deep work. Otherwise, we're up to fixing these symptoms. And Evolution Future Challenge is this way of inviting these projects to present. That is not really a competition, because we try to reinvent the entire structure of the whole thing. So we have prizes, for example, but the prizes are not given to the best projects, right? They are distributed to projects based on the maximum impact that these prizes can make. In some cases, a project that is a little bit struggling a little bit more than that other project that is very well done and established, this other project can use this prize more effectively with more impact because it needs support and the other project doesn't need the support, right? So, and we try to people to, and this eliminates this competition sense. And like last year when we did it for the first time, finalists shared resources with each other and referred each other to other fellowships and stuff like that. And the judges were inviting specific fellows to their own events, some are like in Sweden and stuff like that. So we try to develop this supportive culture. There is not a lot of money in that, and it's good because nobody tells us what to do with this. So we can play and be creative and be open about building the plane as we fly it. And that's something that we do for the second time. The application deadline is August 1st, and you can go to evolutinstitute.com/evo challenge, evolutionary challenge, and apply if you think that you can benefit from that structure.
That's wonderful. At the end of this podcast, we will leave you that details on a slide for everybody to be aware of as well. So Fyodor, thank you very much for joining us today at Your World or Mine. It's been very interesting, and I would actually look forward to actually take this conversation further as well, because I think it's very useful, especially for our younger generations of the world they're stepping into. To be aware of what's happening on a systemic level is very important for them to also be aware of, because it's not something they learn at school or at varsity. So thank you very much for that. We really much appreciate that.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Yeah.
Any last message you want to leave for our younger generations, perhaps? Just a few words.
Be careful with your mentors, and be careful with choosing your mentors, and be careful with following their advice. Think for yourselves.
That's wonderful. Independent thinking. We love it on our planet.
Yeah, and it's not only independent. It's we need to reinvent our cultures and institutions. So don't let these cultures and institutions mold you into the embodiment of the old system.
That's wonderful advice. Thank you very much.
And you can do it together. It's not necessarily independent, like on an individual level. You can think together, but just by choosing your mentors and choosing advice to follow and not to follow, even the best mentors can still be projecting some of the old paradigm on you. So, and be able to play with that. It's not just, oh, I know it better than my older colleagues. No, it's not that kind of independent. It's a kind of being open to reconsidering things and not falling into the enchantment of, oh, this person is really the guru, or this school of thought is wonderful, right? So it's really holding paradoxes, I would say, is essential.
Thank you very much for that, Fyodor. And thank you everybody for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.